Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Eugene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs.
Welcome to the Frontline Innovators podcast. I'm your host, Eugene Signorini, and I'm excited for today's episode. Today's guest is an innovative thought leader who's a prosci certified change management consultant and formerly the Arizona chapter president of the ACMP, Association of Change Management Professionals. She is currently the founder and CEO at Changesync. Please welcome to the show, Kate DeGon. Kate, really excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah. We always like to start out our show kind of with an overarching question. As you know, this is all about the frontline workforce and the challenges that they face. And so we like to ask our guests, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing the deskless workforce today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've had the distinct pleasure of working with many deskless frontline workers over the years. And I think the one thing that has always been at the forefront is time. So this typically tends to be a population who has a lot on their plate and doesn't, often have the luxury of sometimes taking routine scheduled breaks. A lot of times their work might fluctuate seasonally or depending on, the nature of the business, and they're just busy. And so when it comes to, change that's happening that impacts how they work or even where they work, it's finding the time in what is typically their busy schedule. And oftentimes, sometimes the frontline workers are driven by customer demands, right? So really finding the time to figure out that change, internalize it, and become adept at it ahead of that change actually happening.
Yeah. And it certainly seems that like nowadays, right, frontline workers are under even more time pressure, right? I mean, with things like the current labor shortage, it just seems like there's more and more demands on their time just from their core jobs.
Yes. Sometimes they're taking on additional accountabilities because of the labor shortage, to your point. New changes happening. Some learn faster, some take a little bit more time to internalize those changes and get good at them. So yeah, absolutely.
So how does that, that problem of time, right? The time pressure that they're under constantly, how does that manifest itself, particularly in light of kind of organizational change? What does that mean in terms of what are the challenges then that they face, given that they don't seem to have time, to do anything?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this is where change management teams, I think, have to get really creative and really do their due diligence in understanding the frontline workers. And they're not all the same, right? So doing some very specific and unique analysis on those stakeholder groups and really understanding what their challenges are, what their needs are, and really put together a really robust readiness program to communicate with them, help them understand what the change is, what that change means to them, really help that frontline worker feel like they are understood, not only as an employee, but their unique needs as an individual as well. That's one piece of it, right? So understanding how do we even get them prepared for the change, knowing how busy they are, because once they hear about it, that's when the anxiety kicks in, right? The judgment around the change and how is this, what is it going to mean to me and how am I going to get ready for it, et cetera, right? And then it's the actual training for the change itself. So figuring out new and unique ways of reaching this workforce because they are remote, right? Some of them are changing locations on a day-to-day basis. Some are out, driving around. Look at this time of year, it's the holidays. So, take a look at the deskless workforce of, delivery drivers. They're working long hours trying to make things happen. And so, not that there's a ton of change happening at this time of the year, but it does happen. And so really figuring out what ways we can reach this audience and the unique stakeholder groups within to make sure that the change plan we're putting together really resonates with them and the unique nuances, they have, considering that they are remote.
You use this term, use this word readiness, right? And we've heard this from other folks on this program as well. How would you define readiness, right? What does that mean, particularly to a change practitioner? What would that mean to a leader of frontline workers, for example, somebody who's in the operations team? What does readiness mean for the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So readiness is really helping to prepare the employees who are impacted, regardless of the level of impact, really helping to prepare them for the impending change. And this precedes the actual formal training. So, way back in the days before organizations were really truly practicing change management, when a change would happen, maybe there was a project team that would sit in their, project space for a year and plan this change, and then they would roll it out to the organization. Sometimes training was included, sometimes it wasn't, but oftentimes there wasn't a lot of communication or readiness ahead of announcing that change and that change being live. And so, let's be honest, most people are not a huge fan of, opening up their computer or getting a message somehow and hearing that there's a big change. Like, those surprises just really aren't welcomed in the workforce. And so, really the readiness piece of it is, again, figuring out who is impacted by the change. What are those specific stakeholder groups? What activities do we need to prepare for them in order to appropriately ready them for the change, and really get them hopefully excited and feeling okay with the change. We're not going to do that for everybody because there's always your resistors in any type of change, but to the best of our ability, really preparing the different users for what's to come. And some organizations use specific methodologies to use that. Whether it's Cotter, prosci, et cetera. Others use a hybrid or homegrown, but really the idea is to make them aware and give them plenty of runway to move through that change curve at a pace that feels comfortable to them.
Yeah, that's great. And I think this is a really good segue, maybe to talk a little bit about Changesync, because I'm sure many of the folks listening may not be familiar, but it's obviously an organization. It's a company that you created, right, specifically to address some of these challenges. So why don't you just talk a little bit about Changesync, and kind of why you decided that the world needed Changesync, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see, I've been in the field of change management for over 15 years now. And I've worked with some of the nation's largest companies through big types of change, enterprise transformations, ERP implementations, mergers and acquisitions, et cetera. So when you look at the size of those changes, they're big and they're complex. You have many stakeholder groups, you have thousands of impacted employees. You've got lots of people that you need to answer to. And of course, you've got your timeline and your budget. And you certainly don't want the project to fail in any way, shape, or form. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. And I found myself really struggling to work strategically. And reason being is, in order to truly, understand, your stakeholder groups and how you're trending through change, in the change management world, we deploy surveys, we might do readiness assessments. We have feedback mechanisms through a change champion network. Might have, some roundtable meetings, webinars, just any way we can gauge how the people who are impacted by the change are trending is really important, right? So typically, on a monthly or quarterly basis, we're reporting out to the executive sponsor team of, here's how your organization is trending through this change. But in order to do that accurately and do it well, the amount of manual aggregation of data is outstanding. I mean, it's so much, and it's so laborious, and it takes so much time to pull that together that by the time you actually have some sort of semblance of where we might be, it's already outdated. And so I was really struggling because I thought there's got to be a better way to do this. Project over project, organization over organization. I was myself and, those people who are working alongside me or within my structure. We were just spending so much time aggregating data just to try to figure out where we were.
And
And
how
for
were you
me,
doing
that
that?
was
How were you doing that previously? So what tools were you using to kind of keep track of everything?
so we were using Excel, right, or smart sheets. We eventually transitioned to from a spreadsheet perspective. We were using either a survey platform to send the surveys, a document repository, and that was specific to each company, whether that was, SharePoint or Dropbox. We were using Confluence to try to keep track of timelines and project timelines and things of that nature. And so it was just all these, disparate systems that we were having to reference. And again, pull the data from in order to create our change story and our change journey and be able to report out on those numbers. Of course, we were using, if an organization had it, a learning management system. Sometimes they did not, and we would just have to track that manually as well. So just really inefficient and just didn't allow myself or my teams to, at a click of a button, understand how we were trending. And so I knew there had to be a better way. So I went out to the marketplace and I looked, and I couldn't find one. And I thought, well, if I'm experiencing this challenge, there's got to be others that would appreciate a software that's designed specifically for our professional discipline, right? There's hundreds of project management softwares out there. Why isn't there anything for change management? And so I thought, if there isn't one out there, well, then I'll build it. Wasn't my first time as an entrepreneur, and just like to work efficiently and effectively and strategically, especially with change, because it is complicated and it happens all the time. So I built Changesync, and what it does is it brings, it's a cloud-based SaaS, software as a service platform, that brings all of these disparate tools that we use as change practitioners into one platform. So it has dashboard reporting. You can track all of your initiatives and activities, whether it's communication, readiness, or training. In the platform, you can do org-wide reporting on change. It's a multi-filter select where you can query the system to get any level of detail about what change looks like across the organization, send surveys, acts as a document repository. So it just really eliminates all of those inefficiencies that we as change practitioners have had to work with or work within for years. So it's been a fun journey, and it's just really nice to be able to help people work more easily within change.
Yeah, and it certainly sounds like it's kind of this one pane of glass, if you will, right, which provides visibility across the entire spectrum of all the things that you need to do to manage change. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
and obviously, it's funny, most entrepreneurs, right, or most people who are starting businesses are usually doing it because they've seen a problem that they themselves have, right, and
Yes.
nobody's helping them. And it sounds like that's exactly what you said is, listen, I need this. Nobody's got it. So I'm going to go build it myself. I think you made
That's
reference
right.
to this wasn't your kind of first journey into entrepreneurship. And I'd be interested in kind of, how you kind of on your entire journey toward innovation, entrepreneurship, and this, I just would love to hear more about that.
You know what? I guess I'm just not one that I get bored easily. So I like to be challenged. So if there's a problem out there that exists and I see, some opportunity, and I think that my skills and abilities align well with it, I'm always up for the challenge. I always like to learn more and to meet people. And I think that kind of resonates with, being in the field of change management itself. That's why I fell in love with it. Specifically the fact that when we're helping organizations implement change, it's typically to help an organization um, thrive, right? In whatever way strategically that makes sense for the organization. And so to do that, we're always on the forefront of what's next. And we get to see, new and exciting things, whether it's a new ERP or, perhaps it's a really cool way to structure a company to better, see benefits realized and whatnot. But so lots of different, very strategic initiatives that we get to be involved in. And so I think that the fear of change and fear of the unknown is something that just, I guess I probably got over very early on in my career, just because it's the space that if you're going to be a change practitioner, you live in right alongside the people who are designing and implementing that change with you.
Yeah, I really like what you said, which is change can help organizations and people thrive, right? In order to get better, to improve, you've got to change. And it's something that I've observed, and I firmly believe this to be true, is that so many companies are holding back on initiatives, whether those are digital transformation initiatives, whatever those initiatives are, is because of the complexity and the burden that goes along with that change. But at the same point in time, it's kind of holding them back, right, from that improvement.
It is.
Yeah. So how did you become a change practitioner? Like what started you along that path?
So I think it's kind of similar to a lot of other change practitioners, that I didn't even realize I was necessarily doing change management. But I was working for one of the nation's largest higher ed institutions. And at the time, they were going through some pretty rapid growth. So it was a fun time for change. It was a fun place to be. And everyone, for the most part, was enjoying the ride. But it was growth change. And so, how do we continue to innovate a product to stay ahead of the competition that we know is, close on our heels? How do we continue to grow our employee population at such a fast rate without compromising, quality or culture or consistency from a business operations perspective? And, all of that was great. I was even over some of the international expansion initiatives. So, that was pretty fun, a different lens for me on a global perspective. But, what ended up happening is our competition caught up, and, the organization was no longer, had the lion's share of the market. And so then I started managing change on the downside, right? And so a different kind of change, right? So it's, helping with the analysis of, where is our biggest return on investment, and maybe where are the parts of the business that, really aren't maybe necessary for viability anymore. And so either, both of those changes, both of those aspects of change were different. There was parts I liked of both, still a learning curve. But I do feel very fortunate that I had the opportunity to be part of the rise of change with an organization, and they're still around, but a bit of a not necessarily a fall, but getting smaller in size with change. And so from there, I realized I was doing formal change management, and I realized there was a professional discipline that was very much aligned with what I was doing. And so from there, I started seeking out formal positions in change management. So from there, I went on to do a enterprise transformation for one of the nation's largest insurance companies. So that was a big one, and the journey just goes on from there. So again, I think like a lot of people, I didn't even know change management was a thing. I was doing the work. So it was very refreshing and exciting for me when I found out that there was a formal field for the work.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think there are a lot of organizations who don't have a strong discipline around change management. And then you get people that are like the accidental change management practitioners. They're like, oh, great. Can you do this for us? You got, and then I think Nikki Tollefson, one of our other podcast guests, said that's kind of how she got into it first, because she was kind of the squeaky wheel. And they said, great, we'd love you to help out with this. And she became a change practitioner. But it seems more and more, and certainly the guests that we've had on our program here would bear that out, that more and more organizations, do you see this? More and more organizations are starting to recognize the importance of having a formal change management discipline.
Oh, no question. Because at the end of the day, the reality is, you can move boxes on a page, you can create a new product, you can break into a new market, but the people who are really going to make your business successful are the employees. And I think, years and years ago, there was this turn to, employee satisfaction and employee retention. And that was great, but then that just got extended to, hey, when we are going through change, we really do need to focus on the people. The people are what make that change happen. And those are the people that make the change stick. And then hence we get our benefits realized. So, it sounds so simple, but it did take organizations a long time to figure that out. And now I do see more and more them, placing the resources, time, money, and effort towards change professionals to do that work, because the payout at the end is worth. So there's a return on investment. It's hard for people to quantify it, but if you really do your due diligence and look into past projects, and that's another thing that Changesync helps do is you can archive your projects and you can look back on your change agility and playbook, in years in the past, and so it's easier to start to see the return on investment. For change professionals, and it's there, so it's growing.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, I always say that you can, like you said, you can put all the things on a page or in boxes. I mean, you can say it's a technology project. I mean, you can do all the things right. You can select the right technology, and there's an awful lot of time spent on that. But if at the end of the day you don't get your people to embrace it, right, to understand it, to embrace it, then it's the last link of the chain that fails, right? And I think that's kind of what you talked about at the very beginning of our conversation is really that pressure on that end user base. And I'd love to kind of loop us back to that a little bit, which is, you kind of talked about, hey, preparing particularly that frontline user base and really understanding your unique needs. Because I think that's great that you brought that up, which is, listen, just like not employees are all the same, right? Knowledge workers are different than frontline workers, and not all frontline workers are the same, right? They're different users with different jobs people, and different people, and so what are some of the methods that you see, some of the, kind of best practices out there, to really kind of say, okay, how do we understand those user needs? What are the things that you recommend?
So personas have become increasingly popular. It's somewhat similar to doing the stakeholder work, right? So you're just really understanding those, unique populations. I think another one that I've always really embraced over the years, and it's actually one of my favorite things about change management, is really standing up a very strong change champion network. Some people call it different things. I think that's probably the most common term, but, really they are an extension of the various personas or stakeholder groups that we are responsible for helping to move through the change. So when you think about the remote deskless workforce, who are the people that can best represent those personas or those stakeholders, and how do we tap into them, and how do we leverage them as a change team to really understand what those unique needs are of the various populations, because then we really want to create those readiness activities, those specific communications, and those specific training activities that resonate with those unique groups. And us as change professionals, usually the change teams are relatively small compared to the number of impacted people. And the frontline people, they don't know who we are, right? So there isn't trust there. They're not going to pick up the phone and say, hey, Kate, I really want to tell you how I really feel about this change. They're not going to do that, right? But they'll hopefully tell somebody that they trust, hopefully their manager or a mentor or something like that. So being very strategic about how we choose and engage a change champion network is important, because it becomes a two-way conversation for us as change practitioners to create those really robust, unique plans, but also for us to be able to easily and quickly pivot based on how people are thinking and feeling about the changes. Because one day they may feel really good, and the next day they hear something and it makes them not feel so great, right? So we want to make sure that we understand that and get ahead of that, and that Change Champion Network can really help us.
So how do you, I love this idea of a change champion network. I mean, how do you facilitate that? Give me an example of how you would facilitate that at a large organization. How do you identify those champions? How do you kind of bring them together and collaborate with them? I'm really curious to kind of hear about the practical, application of that.
Yeah. So how I've done it time and time again, and have gotten better at doing it over the years, is asking a lot of people a lot of questions and at a lot of different levels of the organization. So of course I start out, at the project level. I'll interview, some of the project sponsors. Usually depending on what the change is, you've got your subject matter experts from each of the areas. And so I really ask them very specific questions about, who is this change going to impact in their organization? Tell me about your culture. Tell me about how you've experienced change in the past. What are the roadblocks that you think we're going to encounter as a change team based on these, impacted audiences in your vertical, et cetera. So I start there, and it's all really good information, but I don't always take it as truth, but it's truth for that person and perhaps at that level. But then I always go down to the next level. I ask the same questions, and I go level by level, and I really do ask permission to talk to some of the frontline employees, because what their reality is may be very, very different than what someone in their same field or area within the organization says about them, right? So, when you talk to a lot of different people and a lot of different levels, somehow you can ferret out most likely what the reality is versus what sometimes becomes people's perceived reality. And so finding that information is really important, because all of that feeds then what is, like I was talking about before, the readiness plan, the communication plan, ultimately training plan. But in those conversations, I also find out who are kind of like the grassroots leaders, and sometimes people who are in the Change Champion Network, they're not a formal leader, but they are a very influential and trusted peer of, let's say the frontline deskless remote workforce, right? So it's finding the people who are wanting to be part of the change, who are wanting to champion it, but who also have the level of trust and influence. And again, it doesn't have to be title influence, but just influence to help bring along the people who will actually need to do the work to make the change happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the locker room analogy, I guess, right? Who really is the person in the locker room, that people turn to, right? Who is that informal leader that they look towards? And I think that's especially true in any organization. It's especially true, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, it brings up, of course, the question of, I mean, you mentioned that the pressures that the frontline workforce is under, right? From a time standpoint, even today, right? So even, trying to reach those individuals today is increasingly difficult just for them to carve out time. I mean, the other challenge that I've always thought about when it comes, and obviously us at Skillful think about all the time, is how do you reach them, right? How do you reach the frontline workforce, right? Because they are by definition deskless, right? They are often at a customer site or spread out geographically, right? They may be on their own. So that raises some unique challenges when you talk about that. Hey, how do we communicate to these people effectively, right? How do we train people effectively? How do companies, deal with that particular hurdle?
Yeah, great question. So I think it varies, and I think I have seen some very unique ways in which companies reach them. So I sometimes at the very beginning of a change project, there'll be a survey that's sent out asking people how they prefer to be communicated with, right? So that's one really good source of information. Once aggregated, you really understand, the various methods and means. And then obviously people are, most people have some sort of device, whether it's a phone or a tablet or, that they're out on the road with, or just, however they're doing their work, they have that. And so finding a way to communicate with them in a very consistent and concise way on whatever device they have is really important. That's why I love Skillful. I mean, it's got so much data for a change data geek like me. I love it, but it's having platforms like that you can plug the unique nuances of each stakeholder group in there and reach them in a way that's meaningful to them. And this is where I also think you can start to leverage that change network if you've set it up right, so that it's a representative group of the unique needs of your various stakeholder groups. Because there are some ways that people are used to communicating, that if you can communicate in those ways and stick with what's consistent for them, that's helpful. So maybe you have, while they might be deskless workforce, maybe there's some leaders who have some sort of 15-minute virtual huddle that happens via telephone or something every morning. Maybe that's the vehicle by which you get on that agenda. You give that leader information to share, or maybe you're a part of that quick roundtable, right? Virtual roundtable. But yeah, so it's finding all of these different, ways in which I think people are already communicated to. And it's also finding the ways that they're not, right? Employees have really good ideas, right? They're constantly saying, okay, gosh, I wish the company would do this. Why don't they think about doing that? Why can't they do it this way? If they only thought about doing it that way, it'd be so much easier, right? So it's being able to connect with them and allowing them to have a voice in how they experience change is important, because if they feel like they've been heard and they see through the actions that what they've recommended is actually happening, they're more likely to move into the change and trust the process, because they feel like they're a part of it. It's not just something that's being done to them.
Yep. And that's not the first time we've heard that phrase, right? Something done to the front line rather than with them. And I think that's very important.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that I kind of took out of, what you were kind of just describing is, you can't make assumptions about what's happening, right? Or what your stakeholders need, even from a communication standpoint, right? Because I always, the thing that I think would come naturally to most change professionals, right? Is, oh, we need to communicate with them. That's great. Okay. But now how do we communicate with them? Right. And, from a knowledge worker perspective, we say, oh, that's easy. We communicate via email or, other collaboration platforms using Slack or Teams or whatever that may be. And all of a sudden you turn around and say, well, actually our frontline workers don't have email. Right. Or they don't check email, or maybe they check email once a week. Right. So all of a sudden, if we're making too many assumptions, we're going to miss something that's critical, right?
Yes.
In our process.
Yep. And I think that assumption piece is huge, because with the lack of information, that's what we do a lot, right? As change practitioners. And that's actually what really bothered me too, was, okay, I don't have data. I don't have a ton of information. So I'm going to assume that things are going well. Some things we did have data for, some things we didn't. But I think that, the more that we can not only understand what frontline employees need from listening to them and baking that into the plans, but really having data to follow up, right? We're asking them to do something, and that ask is part of a larger plan to hopefully successfully move them through the change. But if we don't have a way to easily see if that ask is being accomplished in a meaningful way, then we're assuming that they did what we've asked them to do. And that can be a dicey proposition, especially with frontline workers who are busy, they're struggling with time. So to have a system, like Skillful and other, ways to measure employee engagement and activities and completions and whatnot, it just really gives power to the change team and to leaders, because it's information, and information is power. So it's an easy way to pinpoint where we are and where we need to go, and to involve leaders in a more meaningful and transparent way through the change process. It's not so much of a push that we've seen in the past, when you've got a system like a Skillful, where you can share that data and then it pulls leaders in to help partner with you.
Yeah. And I also think there's always that concern, right? I think you alluded to a little bit, which is, that, it can't be Big Brother, right? Or can't appear to be Big Brother to the front line, right? It has to also be the information that we're gathering as leaders have to be used to help empower that frontline workforce, right? Rather than look at it as, okay, this is just another way that the company is trying to track every single thing that I do, right?
Right. But I do think, I think that's where the, it's also really important that sometimes, the frontline workforce, a change happens, but they don't understand that change in the grander scheme of things, in the context of that larger picture. And so when we're asking them to do something and we're tracking their completion, and it's to help them be successful. And I think that a lot of times people just innately do want to help others. And if you can help, frontline employees not only understand what the change is and what it means to them, but also what doing their part means to other people, either upstream or downstream from their part. I think that's important. And I think that's sometimes a spot that's missed in change management. It's that transition of work, because there are dependencies around, everyone doing what they're supposed to be doing, in that new journey of change. And so, if people understand that, I think innately people don't want to be the cog in the wheel.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we've often heard it's about explaining the why, right? The why we're making this change. But I think you framed it in an interesting way, right? It's not the why is the big company why, right? It's the why of, okay, here's why we're doing it, and here's how it not only impacts you, but the people you work with, right? And it's kind of like, trying to build that empathy, right? Not only with the worker, but for them to build empathy with the other people that are trying to get their jobs done around them. I think it's a really good point. And one that's often overlooked. You talked a lot about the need for data, the need for information, and that need for visibility, right? I think is a really important one. And what's always struck me is that, and I'm sure it has struck you as well, which is why you have founded Changesync, but that, that change management, right, as a discipline has always been very framework focused and process focused, right? Not necessarily so much technology focused, right, to facilitate some of those things. Are we seeing a shift there? Are more companies thinking about, okay, we need more digital tools, for example, to help more accurately facilitate the change management process?
Yes. And I think that one thing that almost pushed that need forward was COVID.
Yeah.
Every aspect of companies were changing, and they were changing all at once. And, organizations didn't have insight into quick insight into where that change was happening, how it was happening, what was the timing, what are the details, who is it impacting? So it made it very difficult to be strategic about how they manage change across the organization. And at a time that was arguably extremely stressful for people, both professionally and personally, right? People had kids at home and, trying to manage work and, it was just so much. And so I think that really pushed forward the desire for companies to say, okay, we had, and quite frankly, looking in the rearview mirror, we were forced to change quickly, and we changed quickly. We made it happen, for most, but the process was a painful one. And they don't really want to go through that again. And they have a greater appreciation for change and being able to change well, and really having insight into what that change looks like across the organization. And the only way you do that is to leverage technology. So just, with Changesync, much like any other, enterprise planning system, the information that you put into it is what you're going to get out of it, right? And so, the more organizations are using the platform to manage, track, and report on their change, much like Skillful, the more reporting that they're going to get out of it, and the more data-driven insights they have into how their organization does with change, how well teams trend with change over time. Maybe there's pockets of the organization that are typically resistant to change. And when you can see that over time, it allows you to be more strategic when it's time to change again, to make sure that, there's not change saturation, or perhaps there's, even more unique plans needs to be put into place depending on, what change has looked like historically with the organization.
Yeah. And
So
there's
yeah,
some,
data's huge.
yeah. And I think, there's this other element which you kind of alluded to. I mean, you talked about how the pandemic has really, caused such massive disruption in organization, and everybody had to kind of change overnight. The reality is, we're not done changing, right? That wasn't a one-time thing. And I think I remember you at the beginning of our conversation, you were kind of, when you were talking about Changesync, you kind of described, hey, there are tools out there for project teams, but none for, change practitioners. And I think very often we typically think of change management similar to project management, in which there's a beginning and an end. But it certainly seems now that, particularly in companies that, first of all, let's look at the pandemic as one thing, is we're in this kind of constant cycle of change. But even outside of that, if you want to be a company that's continuously evolving, there's continuous change involved in that, right? So are companies taking, or how do you think about this as more of like change, instead of not thinking about change with a beginning and an end, but more of a kind of a life cycle or ongoing, you need to manage it in a more ongoing fashion?
Yeah, it's almost like an evolution, right? To your point, there's not a start and there's not an end. And oftentimes what I've seen is, one change, while there might be an end to that change, let's say it's an ERP. So there's a go live date, right? People are still going to use it, and there's probably going to need to be some ongoing, training and some, remediation and whatnot. And obviously maintenance of the system. But, a great example of that is once you start using the system, oftentimes people find that there's efficiencies gained that they couldn't anticipate. So now that, becomes a new change, perhaps it's a restructuring of teams and, redistribution of work. And so, as just like in nature, as one thing changes, it inevitably has some sort of impact on something else. And whether that change becomes a formal change that, a change team is put on, or it's just another change that employees have to kind of work through in a teamwork way. It's happening all the time, and it will continue to happen. And I really, really do believe that the pace of change will continue to increase. I mean, companies are constantly facing, new competition. That's for any of us out there. There's always going to be new competitors in the marketplace. And so, if you want to continue to stay ahead, you have to continue to evolve your product to meet the needs of, the consumer's experience.
Yeah. Do you anticipate, I mean, it's really interesting, would you anticipate a shift in how companies even organize their change organizations to kind of mirror some of that? I mean, one of the things I think about, often increasingly, for example, within IT, we're seeing more and more IT business partner roles, right? Which are, these are IT practitioners who really have responsibility for a particular business unit, right? And they're not project based, they're living that life, right? They're living with those teams, really understanding their requirements and constantly supporting those teams from a technology standpoint. Whereas, as you mentioned, from a change perspective, we may say, oh, does this require a change team to be put on this initiative? Whereas, well, maybe we have a change team that always lives with this group, maybe it's our operations team or whatever it is, to continuously guide them down this kind of journey, as you just kind of described it.
Yes, it is changing. I mean, even the structure of change. I think if you look at it historically, a lot of change teams resided under HR. I think it was a natural fit because it was the people side of change. And they also, in some organizations, and still widely today, live under the IT because, by and large, a lot of their changes in the organization are IT related. But I've seen over the years a big shift where the change team itself is being, the centralized change team is being elevated to work kind of almost at the executive level, because then they are a part of the discussions around, the various portfolios and what's happening at the very top level of the organization, and being able to conceptualize, okay, if this is our strategic vision over the next 5, 10 plus years, then being able to reverse engineer and understand what changes are happening in order to live into that strategic vision. So it helps the change team put the pieces together, but it also helps them understand what parts of the organization are going to be impacted by which changes. And so now they can start to see where there might be pockets of change saturation. There might be, some changes that might have some sort of conflicting aspects. And that happens. But then from there, to your point, it's not one centralized change team can't do it for the entire organization, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're having to stand up different structures, whether formal or informal, to have change representation across the organization. So some people are doing that on a project by project basis. Other organizations I've seen where they have dedicated people in a decentralized fashion across their organization acting as a change agent. Sometimes that's a formal accountability on top of their full-time job. Other times it's an actual position, full-time position that they do, just liaising with that centralized team and carrying forth what change means from the very beginning to the part of the organization they're responsible to represent.
Yeah, and I
So
think
it's
I was going to say, I think it,
Yeah.
based on what you were kind of talking about earlier, right, which is really understanding those unique needs, really understanding the stakeholders, it would seem to me a logical progression, right,
Mhm.
to have those people who are kind of alongside them, kind of, as you said, kind of connecting to that central change team and say, okay, well, what does this really mean for my stakeholder groups now, right?
Yep.
What does this
Yep.
mean for this particular part of the organization? I think it makes total
Mhm.
sense.
Yep. Yep. So they're setting up the structures really to optimize the
Yeah.
efficiencies and the ability to be agile with change.
So, Kate, there's always another question I like to ask, kind of as we wrap up our episodes. And it's interesting because you're not a technologist by background necessarily. You've worked, I think, a lot of change progress in technology, but now you are the CEO of a technology company. So the question I like to ask is, what do you love about working in technology, right? Or maybe being part of now a technology company, and what is it that you don't like so much?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. Let's start with what I don't like so much. It's a big learning curve, right? So, someone, such as myself, who was an expert in change management, of course, I learned a lot about technology doing, tech implementations for companies over the years, but it's a different, it's a different bird when, you're building your own company. And so I think that, it's constantly evolving, and it's having to learn. And I don't have to be the expert in it. I've got a team of people who can be the expert, but I have to understand it, right? And there's so many different layers of running a business that are now supported. Like the foundation is in technology, right? You've got your website, but that there's different components of your website, that are rooted in SEO and security and all of those things, let alone the actual tech product that you have, and supporting that from that perspective as well. So really, figuring out at one point in time what I didn't know, and learning that, and surrounding myself with the people who were experts in that was really important. And that's always a journey for me. I don't think anyone ever arrives to know everything. So, but at the same time, that's part of what I love, right? I love being in the tech space and learning, more about it. So it's kind of a bit of a double-edged sword, right? But creating a product that I know is helping my fellow change practitioners, and being able to, get to know and partner with, other players in the space of change, and those who have an appreciation for it, and creating, awesome products, like a Skillful, and and really being on this journey of people who I consider part of a tribe, right? It's a change tribe, and we understand how hard change can be for people, and really helping to create products and services and experiences that make change easier for people. Because at the end of the day, you know, life can be hard, right? It's busy. We got a lot going on. So if we can somehow make work easier, because change at work is a bit easier, then that makes me feel good at the end of the day.
Well, that's great, Kate. And certainly, we can tell your passion for, change management and helping others in the space. And I really, really appreciate you coming on the program to kind of share your insights and your thoughts. Where can people find out more about you and Changesync in particular? The website is
Changesync.com.
So that's www.changesync.com.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And I'm sure if people want to connect with you, they can find you on LinkedIn.
Yep, LinkedIn, or always shoot us an email. My direct email is kate@changesync.com, or always info@changesync.com is another way to reach us. So happy to answer any questions or meet other change professionals. I love it.
And are you going to be at any events in the new year at all? There people might find you out as well.
Yeah, so we're going to be at the NCCI conference in August. So that's in New Orleans this year. We'll be at the ACMP global conference coming up, and we actually our company is being showcased on a show called Viewpoint with Dennis Quaid.
Okay, where can
so
people find that?
That's going to be actually some portions are going to be aired on Fox Business News and on public television stations across the U.S. So we're likely going to be at the end of January or beginning of February. We're still nailing down that production airing date.
Well, that's great. Sounds like you've got a busy new year, as I'm sure the old year is busy wrapping up. And again, Kate, really want to thank you for taking the time today to speak to our audience. So thanks again, Kate.
Thanks so much, Gene. I really appreciate the opportunity. Take care. Yep. Happy New Year.
Thanks, you too. And we're going to wrap up here. I hope that you listening have found this conversation as enjoyable as I have. If so, please share and rate the podcast. 5-star ratings help ensure that it gets promoted to other professionals like you that are innovating on the front lines. Friendly reminder, this podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the mobile digital adoption platform for deskless and frontline workers. You can visit the Skillful website at skyllful.com. And if you or someone you know is out there innovating on the front lines, we'd love to hear about it. Please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn and share your story. See you on our next episode.